After the destruction of Saguntum, Rome immediately dispatched envoys to Carthage. Their demands were simple: hand over Hannibal and his officers, or war would be declared. Of course, the Carthaginians had absolutely no intention of handing over their leading general, and made the point that it was Rome who had violated Hasdrubal's earlier treaty. Rome, for their part, indicated that the treaty was invalid since the Roman people had not approved of it in the first place. Eventually, one of the Roman envoys stood up and told the Carthaginian Senate that it was up to Carthage whether there would be peace or war. In turn, the Carthaginian Senate said, no, it's up to the Roman envoys. Doesn't this sound like a married couple? In any event, the Roman envoy declared for war, which the Carthaginian Senate accepted, and officially the Second Punic War was on. Meanwhile, Hannibal had established winter quarters at New Carthage after the annihilation of Saguntum. Preparations were already underway for his assault on Italy. First, he left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of all operations in Iberia. Hannibal also provided Hasdrubal with a fleet to protect the coastline of Spain, as Hannibal was confident the Romans might use their recent naval advantage to raid the coasts of Iberia. He also dispatched troops to Carthage and Libya in case the Romans attempted to force a landing in Africa. Polybius puts the numbers sent at 1,200 horse and 13,850 infantry. An additional 4,000 infantry were called up in Africa to garrison Carthage itself. Now it was time to prepare for the epic journey to Italy. Hannibal first dispatched messengers to make contact with the various Gallic tribes along the route. This would provide critical intelligence about the Alps and Po. Hannibal also wanted to make new allies in the Po since he would need reinforcements once he reached Italy. And of course, most importantly, he needed a base of operations in Italy itself, since he would effectively be cut off from Spain and Africa for long periods of time. Polybius indicates that through these messengers, Hannibal learned extensively about the Alps and the Gallic hatred for Rome. We can also assume that Hannibal learned extensively about Rome's most recent war with the Gauls, which we discussed a few videos ago. Hannibal learned that the Boii in particular were excited about starting another war with Rome. And now that Hannibal was coming to Italy, the Boii and the Gauls were in a high state of confidence. In fact, the Gauls and the Po were so stirred up by this recent news that they began attacking Roman settlements in the Po. Lands were ravaged and prisoners taken. A Roman legion in the area was dispatched to straighten the Gauls out. Livy indicates most of the surrounding lands were undeveloped, so the only road in the area led through a thickly covered forest. The Gauls used the cover of this forest to attack and rout the Roman legion, inflicting 700 casualties. The legion was able to set up a line of retreat, but was still hard-pressed by the Gauls. This forced the Romans to divert forces that were originally intended to deal with Hannibal, but now they were sent off to assist the beleaguered legion fighting the Gauls. So with his alliance secure with the Gauls, Hannibal began to collect his army in the spring of 218 BC. By now, Hannibal had received the news from Carthage that he enjoyed the complete support and confidence from the citizens of Carthage. And so with that, everything was in place. Polybius places Hannibal's initial strength at 90,000 infantry and 12,000 horse. Hannibal first crossed the Ebro River. Now, before any crossing of the Alps could be undertaken, Hannibal faced another major mountain range, the Pyrenees. And in the area between the Ebro and the Pyrenees were several hostile tribes that had no love for the Carthaginians. The main reason for this hostility was the fact that many of these tribes were under the sway of Rome. Polybius does not provide much information about these mountain campaigns other than to say several brutal battles needed to be fought before the local tribes there could be subdued. Although Hannibal was successful, his army suffered heavy casualties. Hannibal placed Hanno in charge of this newly conquered area. He left Hanno with 10,000 foot and 1,000 horse to maintain order in the region. He also sent 10,000 troops back to their homes in Iberia. These men would also act as sort of a reserve force in case the Romans launched an assault on Spain. Polybius indicates that after all of these changes, Hannibal's army now stood at 50,000 foot and 9,000 horse. These were his most trusted veterans, the type of men who would remain absolutely loyal given the enormous difficulties they would face in the Alps. By now, the Romans were aware that Hannibal had crossed the Ebro River. Rome opted not to send all their armies to Iberia to confront Hannibal, and perhaps keep Hannibal pinned down there. Instead, the Romans opted to divide their forces into two. Publius Cornelius Scipio would be dispatched to Iberia, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus was to make a landing in Africa. Who knows what was going on with the Roman strategy here, but it sure seemed the Romans still did not comprehend the enormous threat that Hannibal posed to Italy itself. In any event, 2 legions were assigned to Scipio, while another 2 legions were assigned to Sempronius. Complicating this was the fact that 5,000 infantrymen had been stripped from Scipio's army in order to assist the beleaguered 4th Legion in the Po. This forced Scipio to recruit and equip new soldiers, which would delay his departure. Recruiting was needed because, after all, the Romans were not professional soldiers who could move on a moment's notice. And as I said, this would cost the Romans more time, something they had precious little of against Hannibal. By summertime, Scipio was nearly ready to go, and was provided with 60 ships for his army. Sempronius was given 160 ships for his army. The plan was for Sempronius to first sail to Sicily and await news from Scipio that he had been successful in preventing Hannibal from crossing the Alps. If Scipio was successful, then Sempronius would launch an all-out assault against Carthage itself. Meanwhile, Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees. On the other side of the mountain range, he established his camp. Hannibal had no treaty with the Gauls in this area, and furthermore, the tribes along this road were very unpredictable. Some were friendly, and others were completely hostile. Hannibal needed to get through this area into the Rhone as fast as possible. He was even prepared to bribe the tribes with gold to allow for a quick passage. The local Gallic tribes in this area also feared Carthaginian subjugation. As I mentioned, Hannibal did not want to be delayed by a fight with these tribes, and so he sent an envoy to the various tribal chiefs to inform them he had come to Gaul in peace, and that he only wanted to make war in Italy. Eventually, Hannibal decided to bribe the Gauls in this area, which allowed his army to move onwards toward the river Rhone. And that was the last great river before the Alps. Meanwhile, Scipio finally departed from Pisa and sailed to the mouth of the Rhone River. Scipio had received intelligence that Hannibal had already passed the Pyrenees, but he figured, and incorrectly, that Hannibal was nowhere near the Rhone. But since Hannibal had bribed the local tribes, he was able to reach the Rhone far quicker than Scipio thought possible. Hannibal was now only about a 4 days' march from the sea, where Scipio's fleet was anchored. Scipio deemed it wise to send out a scouting party first to determine exactly where Hannibal was located. Also, it's entirely possible that Scipio assumed that Hannibal would hug the coastline on his way to Italy rather than cross the Alps. In that event, Hannibal would have run right into Scipio's position at the mouth of the Rhone. In reality, Hannibal was very close, but intended to take a different route. He was just upstream, about a 4 days' march away. Hannibal made camp on the western bank of the Rhone. Hannibal purchased boats from some of the friendly Gauls and also acquired timber for building yet more boats. Polybius refers to these boats as dugouts, or better yet, let's just call them canoes. Now, the main local Gallic tribe in the area was hostile to the Carthaginians. They were inclined to contest Hannibal's crossing of the river and had gathered forces on the opposite bank of the Rhone. This was a problem for Hannibal since he had no time to waste, especially since there were other hostile Gallic tribes in the area, and also the Romans were only a 4 days' march away. It was critical for Hannibal to make the crossing before the Romans had time to engage his army, and Hannibal was absolutely determined not to fight a major battle before he ventured into the mountains. If he escaped into the Alps, Scipio would undoubtedly lose him. But to attempt a crossing with such a large Gallic force on the other side of the river would have been suicide. So Hannibal decided to send out a detachment under the cover of darkness. The detachment made their way 25 miles upstream and were able to make a crossing that went undetected by the hostile Gallic tribe. They then began to make their way slowly south. And here they waited for a prearranged signal from Hannibal. By now, Hannibal's main force was ready to make the crossing of the Rhone. But in his way, of course, were the Gauls, who were more than ready to oppose his passage. The Gauls were mainly preoccupied with Hannibal's activities, and so they failed to realize that they had been outflanked by the other Carthaginian detachment. So Hannibal ordered the crossing to begin. Infantry in the lighter boats and horses in the heavier ones. The Gauls lined up on the opposite bank, ready for what they assumed would be a wholesale slaughter. A bonfire was lit to give the signal to the flanking detachment to attack. At that moment, they fell right on the Gallic tribe from behind, taking the Gauls completely by surprise. Part of the detachment set fire to the Gauls' camp, and the other part attacked the Gauls on the riverbank. Hannibal's main army also made a landing at the same time, and attacked the Gauls with few casualties suffered. With the Gauls' formation broken, many fled. Hannibal's perfectly timed attack from both directions worked literally to perfection, and his whole army was able to cross the Rhone except for his elephants. That night he made camp on the eastern side of the Rhone River. Preparations were made to transfer the elephants across the Rhone. Hannibal tasked specialized troops for this, as elaborate rafts had to be constructed. Hannibal also met for the first time some of the friendly Gallic chieftains from the Po. They encouraged Hannibal that the Po Valley would meet all of Hannibal's many needs. Hannibal also learned that the Roman fleet was anchored nearby. Hannibal took no chances and sent his Numidian horse to determine the exact location of the Roman army. Amazingly, these Numidians ran right into Scipio's own scouting party. A skirmish broke out that saw heavy casualties on both sides. The Romans followed the Numidians back to Hannibal's camp. Here the Roman scouting party observed Hannibal crossing the Rhone. The Roman scouting party headed back to camp and informed Scipio about what had transpired. Scipio immediately assembled his army and headed up the river in order to catch up with Hannibal. But by the time Scipio arrived 3 days later, he found only an empty camp. Hannibal's army had already departed for the Alps. Scipio knew it would be nearly impossible to chase Hannibal inside the Alps, so he decided to return to his fleet and catch up with Hannibal on the other side of the Alps. Still, Scipio's mission was an utter failure, since Rome's main strategy had been predicated on preventing Hannibal from entering Italy. In the next video, we will cover Hannibal's epic crossing of the Alps and his descent into Italy.